Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining week 12 of the Sustainable Development and Goals for Business series, and welcome for today's seminar. My name is Abdul Salam Busalim, and I will be today the MC for this session. For today talks on the SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production. So SDG 4B is a free online seminar that explores the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and how these are impacting businesses. As I'm sure you are aware of, the 17 interlinked SDGs were developed to provide a blueprint to better and more sustainable future of all. Today we are looking at SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, which aims to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. And we are delighted to be joined by Professor Gasper and Dr. Amod Shah and Mr. Sunil Tankha of the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus, University of Rotterdam, who will be discussing how they are helping to champion SDG 12 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions, and if you have, and note that the chat function is disabled. You will find the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will compile these and ask, and I will ask both speakers to address as many as they can. So with no further delay, I'll hand you guys to Professor Gasper to start his presentation.
Thank you very much. My colleague Sunil Tankha will start the presentation.
Thank you, Des. Thank you, Abdul Salam. Good afternoon, everybody. I don't see any of you, so I'm assuming you're all paying attention there. It's unfortunate that we couldn't come to Ireland, to Dublin, to present this in person. We'll try to make this as interactive as possible given the limitations that we have. We, Des, Amod, and myself did this study a few years ago and have presented these findings in various forums. And we're happy to share this opportunity to talk to you about SDG 12 also. The objective of our original research was really an outgrowth of an earlier project led by Sakiko Kudupar at the New School in New York, which looked at the politics of the indicators of the Millennium Development Goals, which was the previous flagship United Nations program looking at development in the world. And unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which were restricted and really focused on developing countries, the Sustainable Development Goals have a more universal agenda. And so they are not just about development as we understand it for developing countries, but rather an agenda for the entire globe and for all communities of nations. And what we did in this particular research was to examine the process of goal and target and indicator formulation for consumption and production, or sustainable consumption and production. And well, I'll give you a preview. Our main conclusions, of course, were that business interests have shaped the narrative of what is sustainable development and how to get there. And in order to answer these questions, what we need to focus on here is how these forums that debated SDG 12 defined questions of what is responsibility and who is responsible for sustainable consumption and production. Indeed, if you look at the final formulation of Global 12, it moves away from sustainable to responsible. So here, of course, we need to ask ourselves, is it what is sustainable as opposed to what is responsible? And these are issues that have been left, we would say, unanswered. So what we did was, in order to get to really explore these issues is look at how SCP, I'll use the short form, sustainable consumption and production, were conceptualized and how they were operationalized. Okay. Yep, sorry, oops. I don't seem to find the back button. Oh, every time I click, it goes forward. One more back, please. Okay, perfect. So the origins of this whole concept, we need to, we sort of explored where did this whole issues and conceptualizations of sustainable consumption and production start, and we need to trace the history back quite a few years, quite a few decades. In fact, in the early 70s, when there started a focus on unsustainable consumption. One of the first articulations of these kinds of concepts was this construction of a spaceship Earth by Buckminster Fuller. And you could think about this in terms of, let's talk about a space station, which has a finite amount of resources and that need to sustain life aboard the space station. And of course, to deal with the waste products of those production systems. Now here, of course, the focus was much more on dealing with the fact that the resources were finite, right? And this was reflected in another contemporary piece of work, which was the famous Limits to Growth book by the Club of Rome, which was a group of MIT scientists who brought in sort of computer calculations of stocks of resources to figure out how long would it last at current levels of consumption. Here again, the focus was that the Earth might run out of sufficient resources in the process of development and that there wouldn't be enough left for future generations. Around this time, then the debate was a bit about, well, to deal with this, what would we need to do? And academics and thinkers such as Herman Daly were thinking about a steady state Earth in which the focus really was on having more responsible consumption, because the real fear, it was more Malthusian at that time, was that, of course, we would run out of resources. So they calculated, for example, how many years it would take for the Earth's, for oil resources to run out, or for coal, or for metals. What we discovered, of course, over time, that the problem was not so much the issue of the Earth as a stock of resources, but rather the limited capacity of the Earth or natural systems to act as a sink for the waste products of our production systems. But that realization came later, and that realization came a lot with concerns about global warming. However, in order to deal with this, the United Nations started thinking about it, and there was a Brundtland Commission, which was the famous World Commission, that came up with the definition that we are still using for sustainable development, which is the ability to preserve the ability for future generation to meet their own needs. Now, notice here that the emphasis is really on meeting the needs, and therefore, again, the focus shifts a bit, is placed squarely on how do we conceptualize needs, and if you sort of extend that thinking, of course, what is the level of consumption that will be needed, or rather that would be the limit to ensuring that future generations can also meet their needs. Contemporaneous to what was happening here on sort of the United Nations side and the people talking about sustainable consumption were business interests, industrial interests that were dealing with some very strong regulations that had appeared in the 1960s and 1970s. The most important regulations that appeared in the United States, and there were some, let's say, similar kinds of regulations in the European Union, well, it wasn't the European Union so much back then, but in Europe, were the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Acts. And the first Clean Air Act in the United States was in the 1960s, 1963, and then there was another Clean Air Act in 1970. And there was a Clean Water Act in 1972. And these were very strong regulations that imposed significant costs on businesses. So businesses could no longer continue to, let's say, ignore the environmental issues. and they themselves started to organize thinking on what will the new forms of production be. And here, of course, as most businesses would prefer, the focus was more on a technical approach to the issue and more on voluntary approaches or voluntary strategies to meet certain targets established by governments and society, leaving businesses the freedom to select the best technologies and modes of production that would enable both the consumption that we require as well as the ability to deal with limited resources and increasingly limited sinks. So what we had on one side was more about a discussion about consumption and equity in consumption between developed countries and developing countries. And on the other side, a more techno-optimistic approach in which businesses felt that they could contribute to the debate by showing that there didn't necessarily need to be limits on consumption as long as production technologies could take over and improve themselves. So I'm putting up this slide just to show that what we're talking about did not have its origins in the 2010, 2015 period when the United Nations seriously started talking about sustainable consumption and production, or the sustainable development goals in general, but rather started all the way back in the early 70s. So we're really talking about a 50-year time period about discussion along these issues. And I put that up for two reasons. One is to emphasize that the progress on these issues has been glacial in the sense that we're talking about 5 decades just in terms of defining targets and goals, or going back and revisiting targets and goals that have been talked about for a long time, compared to the very short horizon that is left, according to what most estimates tell us, in terms of dealing with climate change. So we are, in a sense, less techno-optimistic and more regulatory pessimistic about the progress that has happened over the last decades. Now, coming to the SDGs in particular, we have, I'll just put the slide up to show you what are the basic areas in which SDG 12 focuses on. So it focuses on natural resource management, food, chemical, waste, and practices of reporting, practices of procurement, information sharing about these issues, all in. And the focus is basically to understand that we have enough information to tell us that we're basically not on track. So issues like subsidies and in terms of waste generation feature tremendously in these issues, but not so much. There's not much focus on climate change, although that is, of course, the main concern in terms of sustainability of production these days. Now, I want to shift the focus from this theoretical and conceptual background to the more to the more empirical issue that we looked at, is what were the processes by which the target of SDG 12 was developed and why it took its present form. The main action in terms of debating the SDG 12 or the other SDGs was this space that was created, which was the Open Working Group. Now, the Open Working Group was basically groups of countries representing different geographic areas of the UN that came together to discuss these issues. So what you would, the way to conceptualize this is small little groups, let's say 3 or 4 countries, discussing amongst themselves, representing their regional views and interests, and then coming to some sort of a consensus within the smaller group to then go into and make presentations in a larger group. So in this way, it was a more manageable form to get different actors and interests together. And the eventual focus of these groups was to discuss 2 issues. One was whether sustainable consumption and production should be a goal in itself, or whether it should be something that is inherent in all of the other sustainable development goals, and therefore should it be cross-cutting rather than trying to be separated from anything else because it's hard to reach the other goals without having sustainable consumption and production. And the other view was whether sustainable consumption and production should be a standalone goal. And there are advantages and disadvantages of both. The fact that it's cross-cutting means that you can address the interlinkages and you can ensure embeddedness across all of the sustainable development goals. But the advantages of having standalone is that it gives the issue of production and consumption much more visibility, and more importantly, assigns responsibility to who is responsible for sustainable consumption and production. And here, of course, the issue is very similar to the issue of climate change, is that the developing countries, of course, have very, let's say, sustainable forms of consumption and production because they're at very low levels of consumption compared to the industrialized world, which is more responsible for unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. So this was a hugely debated issue within the open working group. And in the end, let's say the group of the developing nations managed to convince all the others that it was better to have a standalone Sustainable Development Group, Goal 12. And their interest, of course, was to emphasize that there was a common responsibility, but differentiated depending on the level of economic development amongst different countries, and a less openly stated goal, which was the fact that since developed industrialized nations were more responsible for unsustainability historically, that they also had a responsibility to ensure that more sustainable consumption production patterns were diffused throughout the globe. In other words, that they would contribute to technology transfer for more sustainable production to the developing world. So it wouldn't be, again, that the developed nations with their superior technological capabilities shifted to more, let's say, sustainable production patterns, leaving developing countries to use older and more polluting technologies. So in a sense, both these debates are, of course, closely linked, and that is how in the end, we came up with, or the United Nations came up with, this Sustainable Development Goal 12 as a standalone goal, in which the emphasis is on shared common responsibilities, but differentiated according to the level of development. What we did not see in the eventually, and Amod will talk about this in a few minutes, about the targets and indicators, what we did not see was much of a discussion on consumption. And this was shared in a way by developing countries that obviously want to raise their levels of consumption, and industrialized countries who don't want to sacrifice. So here we have a clear differentiation in the Sustainable Development Goal 12 as it is now, which is really focused on a techno-optimistic approach of production technology, rather than a more, let's say, philosophic view of what does it mean to have responsible consumption. So the focus really is on consumption. So it's a political compromise which focuses on getting broadly defined outcomes, but they're very vague, you could say, and there's not much specificity to it. And the target is really on production and a voluntary business-friendly approach than other observers and activists might have liked. I'm going to turn it over to Amod now, who's going to go a little more into the detail of how the targets and indicators were set, because that really gives you a clear idea of how this was eventually operationalized. So Amod, take over the screen, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. Could somebody just turn my video on? I can't seem to do that from here.
Molly, would you please?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think it's fine now. Yes. Thanks very much. Thank you, Sunil, and welcome to everyone. What I want to do is move on a little bit to the indicator selection process. So just as Sunil talked about the open working group, which was a process of finding and selecting and reaching consensus on targets, there was a similar discussion around the selection of the indicators which will actually monitor progress on these targets. So what we try to do is also look at this process called the interagency and expert group on the SDGs. which was basically tasked with developing this global indicator framework. Just as with the open working group, this was also an intergovernmental process. So it involved about 28 national statistical offices, which were representing the regional groupings. There was also a lot of, as we show at the top of the slide, involvement by other non-state actors. And what we want to stress here is actually especially the role of specialized UN agencies, which were very closely involved in this indicator selection process. Specifically for SDG 12, the United Nations Environment Program was kind of the main organization taking the lead. But you also had the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, the FAO, as well as the World Tourism Organization, which were acting on specific indicators. It's also important to stress that, of course, here we are talking about the indicator selection process of this, what was called the Global Indicator Framework. But these agencies have also been very central to the subsequent development, and I'll go on to that a bit later. The IIEGs, SDGs, this was set up in March 2015, and by about March of 2017, in 2 years' time, was when we had like this broad global indicator framework with a whole bunch of indicators for all of the targets. I think what we noticed when we were looking at SDGs 12 was a couple of things. Firstly, a lot of the discussion already on these indicators for SDG 12, it happened in the first couple of meetings. So there were 4 meetings in this period between 2015 and 17. But we saw a lot of the consensus has already been reached in the first couple of meetings. And we also got a sense that there was less debate and contestation about the indicators for SDG 12 compared to other indicators, but also compared to this whole process of target selection. And I'll go on to that a bit on why we feel that was the case. Just before I go on to the discussion of the indicators itself, I just want to stress here this notion of these 3 tiers. And maybe some of you are already aware of it, but it basically talks to the level of methodological and data availability of these indicators. So a tier 1 indicator would be an indicator which is pretty much ready to be operationalized, but 2 and 3 require further work. So that's also something to keep in mind in terms of these are not all indicators which are the same in terms of the data and their status. If I could move to the next slide, please, Molly. Thank you. So what did we find? Our broad takeaway was that there was a further narrowing of scope and ambition of this goal, SDG 12, from the targets. And I think to some extent, there are practical implications of taking a goal like sustainable consumption and production, which is quite vague, it's quite broad, and then kind of developing it into these measurable indicators, right? Which is kind of the focus of this indicator framework. There is very limited existing data and methodological frameworks to rely on as well. So these are practical implications and challenges. But there are also political sensitivities to how indicators are chosen and reported. If you look at the example of target 12.2, which is sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources, initially the indicator selected was something called material footprint, which basically measures the total impact that, say, your resource use has as a country. But then there was a lot of pushback, especially from countries in the global south, for this notion of domestic material consumption, which kind of makes this distinction between how much am I consuming domestically versus as a country versus how much of this impact is coming through exports and kind of exporting resources to other countries. So there was this kind of a negotiation and development also happening within this indicator selection process. Having said that, we did feel that there was relatively limited debate on these indicators, and especially for 12, compared to this targets and the open working group discussion. To some extent, this may have to do with kind of just negotiation fatigue. You'd already spent so many years coming up through this SDGs process, so it's a little difficult to then kind of think through, okay, fine, let's do this again for indicators. There was a short time, two-year time period of discussion. But also, I think the kind of the notion of what the indicators are, and I think Des will also speak to this a bit later, that this global indicator framework has a non-binding character, these are seen as complementary indicators to what will be developed at the national level. So it's also this notion of how much value people see in this. And finally, the notion of SDG 12 as largely being a broad, vague, and aspirational goal. So then how do you actually go about picking indicators for a goal and targets like that, right? So I think these were some of the implications as to why you see the indicators in the way they are. Molly, could I have the next slide, please? So where did we stand at this point when the global indicator framework was adopted in 2017? One thing we felt is that the coverage didn't really match the targets. So if you look at an indicator like global food loss, which is indicator 12.3.1, it really doesn't cover food losses and food waste on the consumer side. So there were these decisions made based on availability and how data can be used and mobilized. 12.4.1 on chemical and waste management really just focuses on reporting of information under major international conventions. It really doesn't talk about the quality of the reporting. Similarly, 12.5.1 on waste generation focuses just on recycling, but not on waste generation. And even that has been further reduced to just talking about electronic waste. The indicator on food subsidies is a little different. On fuel subsidies is a bit different because it's seen as broader, but there was this notion of cutting down on wasteful subsidies. This is also a very politically sensitive topic. But really what the indicator tries to do is just look at what is easy to measure, which is the overall subsidy burden. Similarly, we see similarly we see an emphasis on quantitative measurement and a checklist orientation. So if you see 12.1.1, which is around counting of countries which have national action plans. 12.4.1 is counting the number of countries which report on these conventions. 12.6.1 is on number of companies which publish sustainability reports. So it's really not about the quality of the reporting, it's just about this counting on it. And lastly, we found that there was, perhaps also because of the nature of this SDG 12, that the selection process, the indicators were not just limited in scope and focus, but they were also methodologically underdeveloped. So most of these indicators really fall under this tier 3 category, where there is neither a internationally accepted methodology, nor is there data available to actually report on these. So that was the status in 2017 when this indicator framework was released. Could I have the next slide, please? And where do we stand now then? I think this period from 2017 to 2020-21 has been quite crucial for the indicators process. It's important to realize that these discussions in the IIEG have been ongoing. So there's been methodological development, definitely. 2019-20 was a crucial period because it was right before the 2020 comprehensive review of the indicators, which is when we see substantial changes also being reflected in the indicator framework. We see progress in operationalizing. So almost all of the indicators are now tier 1 and 2. So that's important to note. But we also see that there have been substantial refinements and replacements. One good example, for instance, is that of the food loss index, which was 12.3.1. So they've added a food waste index. So it covers the second part of the target. So you see these kind of positive enhancements and improvements. Some are more unclear. The notion of counting sustainable public procurement policies, which was 12.7.1, has now become degree of sustainable public procurement. But what that means is not clear because we don't have the data out yet. So you see this kind of like this churn, which is to be expected with kind of an indicator framework like this, but also a lot of lack of clarity. But it's also clear that in certain cases, the scope has been narrowed and limited quite substantially. So for instance, the target or the indicator for the monitoring of the 10-year framework program is now just talking about policy instruments. It's not talking about national policies for sustainable consumption and production. The target around sustainable tourism now talks about implementing standard accounting tools. It doesn't talk about national action plans for sustainable tourism. And I think the point that Sunil mentioned earlier, right, about support from countries from the global north to the south. What you've seen is that this R&D support, which was one of the targets, which is 12.A.1, has now been reduced to install renewable energy capacity. So you see this kind of like this in this pressure to maybe actually measure and monitor and report certain things. There has been this kind of narrowing and these decisions made around what can actually be counted and reported. We want to stress also that the role of the UN specialized agencies continues to be quite important. This is a point that I think Des will also refer to later on, which is that what we're seeing here is this global indicator framework, but it is really an exercise which the UN agencies and a few developed country national statistics organizations have kind of taken on. But there is a parallel program of building complementary indicators at the national level, which are in line with national priorities, realities, capacity, circumstances. So that's also kind of where we need to position these kind of different frameworks, global indicators versus complementary indicators. And lastly, just to point out that this process of collating and presenting of data is still like, it's quite patchy. So you don't see data for all of the indicators even now. But there are some which are kind of reported more prominently. So in the latest reports on SDG 12, you see reporting of the material footprint and the domestic material consumption. You see reporting of fossil fuel subsidies. There's a lot of focus on this SCP policy instruments, which was that how countries are following the 10-year framework program. But you also see kind of the use of proxies because data is not available on the broader issue. And the clearest example of this is actually the use of electronic waste generation and recycling as an indicator for hazardous and just general waste management and recycling processes. So all of that has, at least at the moment, been subsumed into purely electronic waste. So that's the kind of political and practical negotiations that we see playing out even now with the indicators. I'll now hand over to Des.
Des, you should have access to the screen now. You should be able to control it.
Okay, thanks, Amod. Thanks, Molly. This slide is just a summary of what Amod and Sunil presented. So I'm actually going to skip that one and just let's see if I can move the screen. No, at the moment I can't. Molly, could you move to the next screen?
If you just click the screen, you'll be able to control it, I'm pretty sure.
All right, thank you. So here's an example of national level focus and also other processes going on within a particular target, which is the food loss and waste target. Actually, it means sub-goal, really. It's a subsidiary goal area, but SDGs use the language of target, even though some of the then goals are not specified in a way that really is a target. So this is drawing on a 2020 report for this target from a group called Champions 12.3, which is a cross-sector coalition of representatives of some governments, but also big corporations, some consumer organizations, etc. An example of the sort of issue-focused coalition that exists in most SDG areas. And their report is a mixture of the glass is half full and the half empty. So the situation is still really poor in terms of a third of all food is lost or wasted. Some progress though. So for example, as Amod mentioned, the indicator for is now being extended or the interpretation of the target is extended to cover not just some of the stages of the chain, but it also goes beyond wastage along the supply chain up to the shops or restaurants. It also now is being interpreted to cover also loss in the consumption stages. So that's an advance in the practical interpretation, at least by many of the agents involved. And then it highlights 2 countries who are pushing through with, who long before that recent update were paying attention within their jurisdiction, both through government level, but also a lot of the action is coming through these voluntary alliances. So within the UK, there's a coordination group of the big supermarkets like Tesco and others with consumer agencies, environmental agencies, and so on. And the UK claims to be the first country to have got halfway at least to halving the food loss and waste, though they're calculating that with a base in respect to a base year quite far back. And the second country highlighted in that report as having made substantial progress, or the most substantial progress, is the Netherlands. The last point is, again, you see the types of cross-sector alliances who are active as advancing their public profile: Tesco, Campbell Soup, the Scandinavian dairy producer Arla. These people are mobilized in a thing called the 10 times 20 times 30 initiative. I want to step back a little bit in the concluding points to, we've talked about the details of SDG 12 as a goal trying to be operationalized in terms of targets and indicators and the many limitations in that. I want to link it up with the sort of parallel story about the SDGs, which is that apart from being a technical exercise of specifying requirements and targets and so on, it's been a big political exercise of both bringing voices from southern countries more and more central, unlike in the MDGs process, which was dominated by big aid donors, and also of opening up the discussion and making it much more of a public, something in the public arena, something that appeals to wider publics, that brings pressure on governments and businesses, that maybe develops momentum in particular national arenas according to the concerns and opportunities there. And so this is the sort of story you get in the books written by the people like your Irish diplomat, David Donoghue, who was one of the co-facilitators at a key stage in the SDG process, and his partner, Macharia Kamau from Kenya, who was also leading earlier stages of the process. And Kamau articulates this quite forcefully, both in the book that he, Donoghue, as you know, I think is co-author of a good book on the SDGs process, but I would recommend even more the book by Kamau and others, which puts a lot of emphasis both on the mobilization from the South. So as you know, for example, Colombia is the country that originated the SDGs idea, and then built alliances across continents and across sectors. So Kamau has articulated this sort of bigger perspective beyond it being a technical exercise of how good are the targets and indicators. So we have content weaknesses in the SDGs, and the issue is how far, despite those content weaknesses, which are gradually diminishing, how far will the framework help to capture and focus attention, including not just of elites, but of publics who then pressure and induce the elites to give priority to sustainability issues. And within that, then, how far does the inspiring general language in these normative goals, even though we've seen that the targets and indicators are very problematic yet in many, many respects. And how far will the scope for flexibility and innovation and add-on activity at national levels help to go beyond the limits of the global frameworks, where it's hard to specify things that are equally relevant and acceptable across 200 countries. So at indicator level, data is not available. Procedures are not feasible for many, many poor countries. What happens at the national level, though, will depend on how strong, mobilized the civil society, both within the country and in terms of their global networks, are to give this momentum for acting not only through narrow channels, but through many possible channels. So there are lots of open questions. Kamau gave a talk at which Sunil and I were present, in which, interestingly, having chaired the SDGs process, he then said, well, yes, these indicators are all weak, but don't be too frightened by that. So he appeared to express a sort of confident view from emerging middle-income countries like Kenya, where he's from. He's currently the head of the foreign ministry in Kenya. And he said the central purpose of the SDGs is to disseminate norms so that it becomes the norm that we expect people to be sustainable. We expect businesses to be sustainable. We expect consumers to consume responsibly, etc. And they become embarrassed and accountable, and in low public esteem if they don't follow those norms. So how far will such norms actually capture the imagination and the energies of people worldwide? And these are open questions. Here's a little example. India's voluntary national review for the SDGs, and you can see some signs of, as it were, indigenization, local adoption, simply in the artwork there, in which the normal UN representation of the SDGs is converted into Indian art style. How far will indigenization and local roots and local innovation happen for the nitty-gritty issues in SDG 12, reducing food waste, handling chemical wastes, cutting back on fossil fuel subsidies, and the other targets? Well, it's a big research agenda. We don't claim to have the full picture or full answers, but you can imagine that this is going to work out differently, partly in different countries, in different subsectors. And that's it. That's our conclusion. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Des. So let's kick off with some questions from the chat. Let me first, we have one question so far. So first question is, could Professor Des or other speakers explain two things? First, what are the 10 times 20 times 30 initiative is? Two, explain how the UK based their claim to have halved food loss and waste since 2007. So the first question is, what is the 10 times 20 times 30 initiative?
You can easily just Google it and find out. I think it is a particular activity of this Champions 12.3 coalition, which, as I mentioned, includes representatives of various governments, various big corporations, various consumer and environmental NGOs. And Champions 12.3 seems to be seriously active. And then the 10 times 20 times 30 is within that sort of framework, but it's especially, I think, a cooperation of the big supermarkets and related food corporations to show that they are making progress in reducing food loss and waste, that they don't overstock the shelves so that too much stuff is there at the end, is nearing its expiry date and gets destroyed. Or some of the progress they're making apparently in reducing waste is by giving more to food banks in the UK, certainly. And it's not really a sign of a happy situation, but it's a big improvement on chucking food away. Quite a lot now is consciously being channeled to food banks.
The 10 refers to the 10 largest food retailers that they're supposed to work with their 20 of their major suppliers to achieve by 2030 the 50% reduction in food waste.
Thank you. There's another question. Is there allocation to view reporting on these and particular SDGs, that specific countries? So specific reports for SDG 12, where they can view them?
I think you find sections in the national reports, and then in highly resourced countries like Netherlands, UK, etc., you probably find separate SDG 12 progress reports.
Can just chip in there also. There's the voluntary national reviews, which are quite detailed, but these are not for all the countries. And there's also on the SDGs website, for instance, there's a lot of effort now to also compile statistics. Just to note also that this is pretty much for what are these global indicators, right? So data is still patchy, but there's an effort to consolidate that. So you'll find it on the IIEG SDGs website, as well as on the SDGs website. Quite a lot of the data is there.
Thank you. Another question here. How do we ensure countries, companies, and organizations are measuring the same things in the same way in terms of sustainable consumption and production and consumption?
Amod, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can. I think that's the challenge. So one of the things that came up a lot in the discussions when we were going through the open working group discussions was this need to move away from same methodology, same targets, same kind of checklist orientation, because that was one of the criticisms of the Millennium Development Goals. So as Des mentioned, also a key aspect of the SDGs and where it's different from, say, the Millennium Development Goals is to really focus on norm setting rather than the nitty-gritties of measurement. So there is this effort in the global indicator framework to have this nice, clean, kind of methodologically sound list of indicators, but it is not something which is really imposed, or the attempt is not to impose this on countries, but rather allow for freedom for people to also report, countries to report and measure things which are relevant for them. So just to maybe the unsatisfying answer is there isn't the same methodology, with the possible exception of the global indicator framework, but that's also by design, I think, not necessarily just a flaw in the process in that sense.
Same manner, another question here. How effective does the panel believe that the SDGs have been in norm setting globally? And amongst different groups, political, reign, business, civil society, are there any trendings emerging? So this is open to, not specific to any of you, but it's just open question.
I think all of us have a different take on it. So probably just go around the table. My view is that the SDGs are ancillary to this norm setting. There's a number of different forums or spaces where these norms are being set. And the visibility of the SDGs is not front and center in many contexts. In many contexts, it's completely different trends that are guiding this idea of sustainable production or consumption. You can see it with the issue of the electrification of vehicles. That's not something that's coming out of the SDG. It's coming out of a more, as I mentioned earlier, techno-possibilistic approach where on the one hand, you have these entrepreneurs taking on a center stage and pushing certain technologies embedded in products. So a very commercial aspect. So it's obviously not SDG, although it's making great progress. But then it's also at the level of the countries. Right now in Italy, for example, with the formation of the new government, they actually are thinking or trying to set up sort of a department or a ministry of the economic transition to a green economy. So that's happening at a national level where the word, SDG isn't really front and center. So it's happening in enough of different forms, and SDG, in my opinion, is one of them that's perhaps more visible in certain countries, and maybe in the global south, and less visible in others.
Thank you, Sunil.
I think it's a huge question to answer, which we can't. So as Sunil says, there are so many different arenas, different targets, different countries, and the story, we don't know the answers. How it'll play out, we can expect will be different, will vary a lot. Compared to all previous UN agendas, though, the SDGs are a lot more prominent. And for example, they have reached into civil society quite widely in schooling, and school children tend to know what the SDGs are. The Museum for Schools here in The Hague has a permanent exhibition organized around the themes of the SDGs. In a country like the Netherlands, SDGs, I would say, are sort of moderately known. And in the current election coming up in the Netherlands, there's I would say, unprecedented degree of sustainability talk amongst lots of political parties, not just the previous Green Party. It has been taken up as a badge of respectability by most of the parties. And I think SDGs have contributed to that.
Thanks. Last question here. Has COVID changed how we look at more regional production opportunity, impacting local market and suppliers? So the effect of COVID in this goal.
I can maybe just chip in on that. I think not to maybe speculate so much on kind of where it leads to, with specifically on the indicators, but one thing we did notice in kind of looking back at the reports this year is really this framing of COVID as an opportunity for SDG 12. So if you see the reports and the discussions, a lot of it is that COVID-19 offers us that the world is clearly not on is clearly on an unsustainable path. So I think there's also an acknowledgement of that in the discussions around material footprint and fossil fuel subsidies and waste generation, but also that COVID-19 offers us an opportunity to move to a more sustainable consumption and production path. So there is definitely this framing. The question of then how that translates on the ground is a more tricky one, and it really, that's where the political and the society and the business emphasis on kind of SCP and the SCGs comes into play, and that's very variable.
I would also add there, though, and this is important, is that although at the level of creating a discussion space, the idea that COVID gives us the opportunity to reset is there, in reality, things have moved in the opposite direction. There's an increasing concentration of production, especially in China, because of the way global distribution got affected through COVID. So when you look at Amazon as an example of having tripled its market cap over the last year, most of the products sold on Amazon come from China. So what you have is the local productions unable to access these distribution channels because that was not how they operated earlier on, basically going out of business. So a lot of smaller family-oriented enterprises do not have the capacity to continue. And their production is being supplanted by the international supply chain networks, mostly based in East Asia, distributed by companies like Amazon. So although, I agree with Amod, it's in terms of a talking point, it gives us a chance to reset. In reality, it's put us even more, especially this year. We don't know how it'll start next year when hopefully these companies will start again. But in reality, right now, the production is shifted even into more concentrated forms. And again, when you buy through Amazon and you don't see the product, things like the sustainability of its production actually diminishes with respect to price because of the way the algorithm presents the products to you. So I'm more pessimistic about that particular angle based on what's happened.
Okay, now that was very interesting. Before wrapping up, just would like to thank Professor Des and Dr. Amod and Mr. Tankha for taking the time to give us an insightful and an interesting presentation, and to all the participants for your participations. For those who are interested in SDG 13, climate action will be presented next week, March 3rd, as part of Transform the Circular Economy event. So we will be circulating a new registration link for that in the on this, DCU Business School and .lab channels. So for everyone who would like to be to take part in this, and for those of you who are interested in the Transform event overall, the event actually run from 1st to 5th of March, and discuss the impact of increased connectivity on equality of life and economic development in urban and rural communities. You will find the registration link online and on our social media channels. And in the meantime, stay safe, and thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the day. See you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.